Standing Order 38, a motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been made and seconded at this time. Therefore, the question is that this House do now adjourn.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. February is Black History Month. Events from coast to coast to coast give Canadians an opportunity to celebrate Canada's diverse Black community. For many of these communities, their stories, their history, their contributions, both in the past and today, do not get the recognition that they deserve. Black History Month serves to remind us we can and we must do better. But while this government talks about doing a lot of things better, they often fail to take action. A year ago, the Prime Minister said it was time to take action on anti-Black racism in Canada. Budget 2018 even provided some good first steps for funding. But even the Liberal MP for Hull Almer, chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, is publicly complaining about how little is actually changing. He spoke about the need for public service buy-in to the initiatives. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, leadership comes from the top. Before blaming the public service, we need to recognize that the Minister of Heritage set the tone by suggesting that systemic racism doesn't exist in Canada. In October, I asked the Minister 4 times to acknowledge his out-of-touch statement that systemic racism is not part of his vocabulary. The Minister's comments were an insult to racialized and visible minority Canadians. For Canada's Indigenous communities who contribute and continue to deal with the legacy of colonialism on a daily basis, his comments are a slap in their face. If the Minister took the time to read the Heritage Committee's report, taking action against systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, he would get a glimpse into the impact of systemic racism for the Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit community from Senator Sinclair and Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Senator Sinclair said, and I quote, "Systemic racism is the racism that's left over after you get rid of the racists. Once you get rid of the racists, within the justice system, you will still have racism perpetrated by the justice system," end quote. The Minister today has yet to apologize for his comments. The Minister was caught out with those outrageous comments because it was reported in the media. He learned that systemic racism exists in Canada through a process of open and public accountability. It is no small irony that the consultation process for Canada's anti-racism action plan was done behind closed doors. Participants are by invitation only. Canadians have no information about it. We don't know who was invited or what was said. All we know is that the consultations are now closed. This is the same old story time and time again. The Liberal government makes a bold announcement. They say that they're the most transparent government ever. Then they engage in a pretend exercise of consultations behind closed doors. I've learned from some participants that they are asked only to comment on a few very specific questions. Some left wondering what the purpose was. Maybe it's so that they can elicit the kind of feedback on developing a program that the government has already decided on so that they could produce the kind of photo ops that they want. Even members of the Liberal caucus are growing frustrated. The Minister should apologize for the insulting comments and let the light of day shine on the process to develop Canada's anti-racism action plan.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism.
Madam Speaker, we'll speak frankly. Now, despite Canada's reputation as a welcoming, multicultural society backed by laws and policies to combat racism and discrimination, various forms of systemic racism and discrimination continue to exist and persist in Canada. Nous savons que toutes les formes de racisme institutionnel.
We know that all forms of systemic and institutional racism and discrimination have a direct impact on Canadians, in particular Indigenous people and racialized groups. This can affect them in a number of different ways in their lives, whether through processes where they try to obtain a job or interact with the criminal justice system or the health or education systems.
Canada is also not immune to hatred and bigotry. We recognize that discrimination and racism against Indigenous peoples are systemic in Canada. Past paternalistic and disempowering federal policies and institutions have perpetuated and deepened racism and discrimination against Indigenous groups. Sadly enough, Indigenous peoples and racialized women and girls are among the most disadvantaged groups when it comes to their economic outcomes and social participation. Le racisme sous toutes les formes
Racism in all its forms is unacceptable, and we should not tolerate it. Diversity is our strength, and when we embrace it in a spirit of cooperation and openness, we all benefit.
Budget 2018 had committed a total of $42 million to address racism and discrimination targeted against Indigenous people and racialized women and girls. Also to plan cross-country consultations on a new national anti-racism approach and to enhance community supports and research to address the unique challenges faced by Black Canadians. We're consulting extensively to develop this anti-racism approach and have heard firsthand from Indigenous peoples across the country on the issues that they are facing.
As the Prime Minister said, no relationship is more important than that between the government and Indigenous peoples. We have clearly indicated our intention to renew our nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples, founded on the respect of their rights, cooperation and partnership. We will not be able to achieve true reconciliation until Indigenous peoples are treated fairly and equitably.
The implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, several of which focus on addressing racism, and to create a recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework, which will ensure that recognition and implementation of rights is the basis for all relations between Indigenous peoples and the federal government.
Reconciliation is not only an Indigenous problem, it's also a Canadian issue. We need to seek to eradicate all forms of institutional and systemic racism and discrimination that affect the social fabric of our country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Being Black History Month and that the anti-racism plan consultations are apparently over, I would have thought that the Minister of Heritage would have taken this opportunity to stand in this House and apologize for his comments and lay out the pathway forward. The Parliamentary Secretary acknowledges there's systemic racism, yet the Minister himself said that is not in his vocabulary. Sadly, this is not the case. Whether it's the housing crisis at Cat Lake or reports of coerced sterilization, the Indigenous community is well aware that systemic racism exists. Canada's Black community knows it well too. Today, Black Canadians are still stopped far more frequently than other groups of Canadians through the practice of carding. In 2016, former Hamilton City Councillor Matthew Green, who will be running for the NDP in Hamilton Centre this fall, was street-checked while merely waiting for a bus. Black Lives Matters, and the time for action is now.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I can edify my colleague with the news that the Government of Canada remains committed to meaningful and evidence-based communities involved and whole-of-government initiatives in the pursuit of equality and growth for all Canadians. That is why Budget 2018 committed $23 million to Canadian Heritage to address racism and discrimination targeted against Indigenous peoples and racialized women and girls to support cross-country consultations on a new national anti-racism approach. Budget 2018 had also committed $19 million to Canadian Heritage and Public Health Agency of Canada to provide community supports for Canadian Black youth at risk and to develop research in support of more culturally focused mental health programs in the Black community. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chalabourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It was a very